History writes the fate of some geographies in blood, and others in freezing cold. But no geography on Earth has experienced such extremes, harboring such immense contradictions and tragedies within itself as Russia. This story, stretching from the gilded, opulent halls of the Winter Palace to the freezing winds of Siberia, is not merely the fall of a dynasty, the 300-year-old Romanovs. It is the anatomy of a vast empire, its spirit divided in two, alienated from its own identity and swallowed by itself as that great fault line ruptured. To understand the foundations of our story, we must go back much further than the bloody streets of the infamous 1917 revolution, to the late 17th century, to the dark and insular world of the Moscow Principality. At that time, in the eyes of Europe, Russia was merely a vast, snowy, and barbaric area at the edge of the map. While Europeans were experiencing the Renaissance, the printing press, overseas explorations, and scientific advancements, Russia, with its rigid dogmas of the Orthodox Church, long-bearded boyars, traditional nobles, and millions of peasants chained to the land, seemed almost stuck in the Middle Ages. That is, until the moment when that shocking figure, Peter I, known to us as Peter the Great, ascended the throne, a figure who would change the course of history with his brute force, immense stature, and inexhaustible energy. Peter was no ordinary Russian czar. He hated the stifling, incense-scented palace chambers of Moscow. In his youth, he had gone to Europe under a false identity, posing as a simple carpenter, working in shipyards and studying the mechanical clatter, ships, science, and military discipline of the West. Upon his return, he had one obsessive idea: to modernize Russia by force, even through bloodshed, and make it a part of Europe. However, when you try to change a society from above through state coercion, you tamper with its genetic makeup. Peter the Great's modernization drive was not a natural development, but a violent cultural trauma. His first act was to personally cut off the long beards of the highly respected boyars with scissors. He banned traditional Russian clothing and forced the court to wear tight European attire. He did not hesitate to torture and kill those who resisted his new vision of the state, even his own son, who remained loyal to the old order. But the real dagger Peter plunged into the heart of Russia was not ideological, but geographical. He moved the capital from the 1,000-year-old Moscow to the freezing, marshy land where the Neva River flows into the Baltic Sea, building a brand new city on the bones of tens of thousands of peasants, St. Petersburg. This city was to be Russia's window to Europe, but this gilded window was also the beginning of the enormous chasm that divided Russian society in two. In the magnificent marble palaces of St. Petersburg, a new aristocratic class emerged, raised by German governesses and following Parisian fashions. These elites, finding their native Russian language vulgar, began speaking only French, and they became completely cut off from the millions of peasants just a few hundred kilometers away, plowing the land with wooden plows, eating black bread, and adhering to a deep Orthodox faith. Two distinct nations were created, living in the same geographical area, but unable to understand each other's language. The nobility despised the common people, while the common people viewed the nobility as antichrist and foreign. This was the poison that would accumulate behind the magnificent walls of the Winter Palace for centuries. Peter had given Russia a vast army and an imperial vision through coercion, but in return, he had shattered Russia's soul. Although this westernized empire had become immensely powerful, beneath that gilded shell lay a sociological time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. And while the arrogant czars of the Romanov dynasty danced in their palaces, in the freezing darkness outside, the vast, impoverished masses slowly began to sharpen their own anger. The seeds of westernization that Peter the Great planted in the heart of Russia bore a strange, dazzling, yet equally unhealthy fruit by the end of the 18th century. Through the European window that Peter had forcibly opened, not only ships and architects arrived, but also the ideas of the French Enlightenment. However, these ideas were not intended to liberate the people across the vast Russian landscape, but rather to utilize the absolute and oppressive power of the Winter Palace as a philosophical tool. The ultimate symbol of this era and this great contradiction was an ambitious German princess who, in fact, had not a single drop of Russian blood in her veins, Catherine II, also known as Catherine the Great. When Catherine overthrew her husband in a palace coup and ascended the throne, she continued Peter's unfinished dream of a European Russia. She had the Hermitage built next to the Winter Palace, a museum that remains one of the world's greatest art museums today. She amassed all of Europe's magnificent paintings, sculptures, and books, bringing them to St. Petersburg. Catherine the Great described herself as an enlightened despot. She corresponded with French philosophers Voltaire and Diderot, explaining to them how she had established reason, science, and the rule of law in Russia. For Parisian intellectuals, she was a guiding star illuminating the darkness of the East. But the real Russia, ruled by those elegant hands that read Voltaire's letters, was not as it appeared from the windows of the Winter Palace. While Catherine spoke of philosophy and freedom, the most brutal and inhumane system of slavery in Russian history, serfdom, krepostnoye pravo, reached its absolute peak during her reign. Serfdom was not merely about being bound to the land, it was about millions of Russian peasants, or mujiks, becoming literally commodities that could be bought and sold without any legal rights. St. Petersburg newspapers were filled with advertisements for people such as skilled cook for sale, good-natured young maidservant, or healthy farm workers. The nobility could lose entire villages along with thousands of people in a single night at the gambling tables. It was commonplace for a nobleman to trade 3 young peasant girls for a purebred hunting dog of his choosing. Catherine, to appease the aristocracy to whom she owed her throne, even forbade peasants the right to complain, leaving them entirely at the mercy of their masters. Here lay the enormous sociological chasm that shattered the Russian spirit. While the nobles of St. Petersburg conversed in ballrooms, drinking champagne and engaging in philosophical discussions about Rousseau's Rights of Man, just a few hundred kilometers away, millions of their fellow Russians slept in barns with animals, dying under the whip. The Winter Palace was a theatrical stage. The real Russia was a vast open-air prison. However, no social pressure can be kept under control forever. In 1773, south of the Volga, one of history's bloodiest rebellions erupted against this unimaginable injustice. A Cossack named Yemelyan Pugachev, posing as the assassinated Tsar Peter III, gathered hundreds of thousands of enraged serfs, deserters, and miners and declared war on the state. The Pugachev rebellion was no simple peasant uprising. It was a brutal revenge taken by the dark and silent Russia, oppressed and dehumanized for centuries, against the gilded, French-speaking Russia. The estates of the nobles were burned, and thousands of landowners were torn to pieces by the peasants' scythes. Catherine, setting aside her philosophy books, led her armies into this hellish fire. The rebellion was suppressed in a bloodbath. Pugachev was displayed in an iron cage in Moscow before being brutally executed in the town square. The Winter Palace breathed a sigh of relief. The rebellion had been crushed, order restored. But the deep wound Pugachev inflicted had forever etched a great fear into the minds of the Russian aristocracy, the fear of the people. The palace now knew their own people were far more dangerous than any foreign army. And this fear would transform the Russian state into an increasingly ruthless, paranoid police state, ultimately setting the stage for the great catastrophe of 1917. As the dawn of the 19th century broke, the cries for freedom and equality of the French Revolution, which shook Europe, echoed against the thick walls of the Winter Palace and the freezing shield of censorship in Russia. That is, until Napoleon Bonaparte, the rebellious child of the revolution, invaded Russian territory in 1812 with the largest army history had ever seen, the Grand Army of 600,000 men. Napoleon's invasion was not merely a military crisis, but an unprecedented struggle for survival for Russia. Tsar Alexander I called upon millions of serfs who, until then, had been seen only as property and oppressed under the whip, to serve in the defense of the fatherland. Interestingly, these impoverished Russian peasants who had only suffered oppression from their masters showed incredible self-sacrifice in defending their lands. They set fire to their own homes, fields, and even the sacred city of Moscow to prevent it from falling into Napoleon's hands. That freezing Russian winter and the incredible resistance of the peasants condemned the army of the invincible Napoleon to a death march through the snow. But the real sociological shock came after the invasion was repelled. The Russian army, pursuing the fleeing French, marched into the heart of Europe, all the way to Paris in 1814. For the first time in their lives, young, aristocratic, and educated Russian officers stepped outside the censorship shield of the Winter Palace and saw the West with their own eyes. The sight they witnessed was an explosion in their minds. There was no serfdom in Paris. The peasants were free. Constitutions, parliaments, freedom of expression, and the rule of law were being debated. The Russian officers painfully realized that the France they had defeated was centuries ahead of their own country in terms of civilization and freedom. When the war ended and they returned home, that harsh reality struck them like a slap in the face. The heroic Russian peasant who conquered Paris and liberated Europe from tyranny, upon returning to his own country, found his weapon taken from him and was sent back to his master's stable, to the whip. This injustice inflicted a huge wound on the souls of those young officers who had seen the lights of Paris. They began to feel shame for their own country. "We saved Russia from Napoleon," they said, "but who will save Russia from the Tsar and serfdom?" Secret societies were formed, whispers turned into plans, and when the date showed December 14th, 1925, the expected spark ignited in the power vacuum created by the sudden death of Tsar Alexander I. On that freezing winter morning when the new Tsar Nicholas I was to ascend the throne, the reformist young officers led the 3,000 soldiers under their command to Senate Square in St. Petersburg. Right next to the Winter Palace, for the first time in Russian history, it was not the people or peasants, but the most elite officers of the army themselves who were rebelling against the Tsar. Their demands were clear: the end of absolute monarchy, a constitution, and the complete abolition of serfdom. However, the rebellion, due to the indecisiveness of its leaders and the failure of other troops to come to its aid, turned into a standoff lasting hours in the freezing cold of Senate Square. Tsar Nicholas showed them no mercy. Towards evening, he ordered the artillery to open fire. In just minutes, the square literally turned into a bloodbath. Shrapnel fired at close range tore apart soldiers and innocent civilians who had come to watch. The rebellion was crushed, the snow stained red. This event, which went into history as the Decembrist Revolt, lasted only a few hours physically and failed. 5 young and idealistic officers who led the rebellion were hanged, and hundreds more were sent to the freezing mines of Siberia as lifelong galley slaves, shackled at their feet. But Tsar Nicholas failed to realize something. What he had suppressed with artillery fire in Senate Square that day was not just a rebellion, it was the birth pangs of the modern Russian intelligentsia. The Decembrists became legendary in the minds of the Russian people as those sacred first martyrs. On that day, the Tsar and his state irrevocably severed ties with their intellectuals, artists, and conscientious citizens. The clanging of the chains on the feet of those officers exiled to Siberia was the first sound of the colossal revolution that would break down the gates of the Winter Palace almost a century later in 1917, and Tsar Nicholas would transform the empire into an unprecedented dark and vast police state to stop this awakening. The chilling Decembrist revolt of 1825, though physically suppressed, left a profound trauma in Tsar Nicholas I's mind that would last a lifetime. Nicholas was not a romantic leader like his brother Alexander, interested in philosophy or Western liberal ideas. He was a harsh, suspicious, and ruthless autocrat whose spirit was forged in barracks discipline, who sought to rule the state like a massive military battalion. The fact that even his own elite officers had turned their weapons against him taught Nicholas one thing: those harmful European ideas infiltrating Russia, the dreams of freedom and equality, were a virus rotting the empire from within, and this virus had to be eradicated at all costs. Thus began an unprecedented, chilling, and dark period of autocracy in Russian history. To protect the empire from those philosophical viruses, Tsar Nicholas imprisoned the state in a veritable quarantine, a massive iron cage. The greatest guardian of this cage was the 3rd Division, the predecessor of the modern Russian secret police, personally established and directly subordinate to the Tsar. Censorship reached unimaginable proportions. Even the use of words like freedom, society, and progress in newspapers was forbidden. The import of foreign books was stopped, and philosophy departments in universities were closed. Even one of history's greatest geniuses, Dostoevsky, was brought before a firing squad to be executed simply for reading a banned poem. Just before the trigger was to be pulled, a last-minute pardon sent him to Siberia as a convict. From the outside, Nicholas's Russia appeared as a terrifying, invincible giant. In 1848, the Tsar had sent his armies across the border to crush the waves of revolution shaking Europe, saving European kingdoms, and earning the title of Europe's gendarme. He commanded the largest army in Europe, composed of millions of enslaved serfs. From the windows of the Winter Palace, everything seemed perfectly ordered. Soldiers marched in uniform, and the bureaucracy ran smoothly. But this order was not the health of a living organism, but the frozen stillness of a corpse. While the world outside Russia was advancing with the dizzying speed of the Industrial Revolution, Russia had withdrawn into itself, believing it had stopped time. This terrible illusion was shattered by the Crimean War, which erupted in 1853. Tsar Nicholas mobilized his armies to dismember the Ottoman Empire, then known as the Sick Man of Europe, and gain access to warm seas. However, he faced not only the Ottomans, but also the superpowers of the time, Britain and France, who feared this expansionism. On the Crimean Peninsula, before Sevastopol, one of the greatest confrontations in human history took place. This was not just a clash between two armies, but between two different eras. The British and French armies arrived on the battlefield with steam-powered armored ships, telegraphs, railway logistics, and rifles. Their Russian army, however, was still fighting with wind-dependent wooden galleons, primitive smooth-barreled rifles from the Napoleonic era, and starving and exhausted serfs pulling ammunition in ox carts through the mud. Russia's massive, seemingly invincible army practically melted away in the bloody mud of Crimea. Logistics had collapsed, sand had been sent to the soldiers instead of gunpowder due to corruption, and the incompetence of the commanders had driven the state to ruin. Russia not only lost the war, the backwardness syndrome, which it had tried to conceal from the world until then, was shamefully exposed before the eyes of the entire world. The gilded vision of the Winter Palace had been shattered by the steel gears of technology and industry. Tsar Nicholas, witnessing firsthand the rottenness of his own system and the death throes of the empire, contracted severe pneumonia in 1855.
According to many historians, what killed him was not illness, but the profound grief and heartbreak caused by the shattering of his arrogance of invincibility. At his deathbed, he would turn to his son, Alexander II, to whom he would abdicate, and whisper that historic and painful confession: "The state to which I entrust you is unfortunately not in a good state." It was a bitter truth that Russia could no longer be ruled by the whip, the secret police, and censorship. If the empire was to survive, a radical and transformative operation was necessary, and this operation would begin with the great move that would change the fate of millions: the emancipation of the peasants.
The humiliating and disgraceful defeat in the Crimean War and the sorrowful death of Tsar Nicholas I had a devastating impact on the Winter Palace. His son, Alexander II, upon ascending the throne, could see the stark reality. Without breaking the enormous medieval shackles binding Russia, the system of serfdom, it was impossible for the country to industrialize, build a modern army, and survive. Unlike his father, Alexander was a realistic leader. He gathered the Russian aristocracy in Moscow and issued that chilling warning that went down in history: "Gentlemen, it is far better to abolish serfdom from above with our own hands than to expect the peasants to revolt and abolish it themselves from below." In 1861, even before the abolition of slavery in the American Civil War, Tsar Alexander II signed the monumental Emancipation Edict. In a vast empire, overnight, a staggering 23 million people, almost a third of the population, were officially declared free. They could no longer be bought and sold like commodities. They could marry and trade. While the Winter Palace celebrated the Tsar as savior and popped champagne, the situation in the villages of real Russia was quite different, because this freedom was an apple filled with poison. It's a sociological rule: if you give freedom only on paper to an agricultural society without land, you only condemn them to starvation. The state did give the peasants land to cultivate, but it did so by buying it from its former owners, the aristocrats, at exorbitant prices, and the bill was passed on to the peasants. The freed serfs were burdened with a terrible atonement debt to the state for those unproductive, tiny pieces of land, a debt they would have to pay for 49 years. The peasant was no longer the whip-wielding slave of the landowner. He was a slave to the banks, the state, and endless debts. Moreover, since the tax burden was shifted to the village communes called mir, it was effectively forbidden for peasants to leave the village and migrate to the city. This half-baked reform profoundly undermined the naive, sacred loyalty of the peasants to the state. Millions of mujiks believed that the Tsar had actually granted them true freedom and free land, but that wicked nobles had concealed the real decree and read them a forged document. Disappointment gradually gave way to a deep, silent anger. It was precisely in the midst of this sociological crisis that a brand new, angry, and radical generation was emerging in the universities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. These young intellectuals, educated, knowledgeable of the West, and engaged in philosophical discussions, the intelligentsia, understood that the Tsar's reforms were a mere facade. Initially, they went to the villages to teach and practice medicine, aiming to enlighten the peasants and prepare them for a revolution. This romantic endeavor, known in history as the Towards the People movement, ended in complete failure. The peasants did not understand the language of these urban youths, suspected them, and even reported them to the police, accusing them of opposing the Tsar. Realizing they couldn't educate the peasants, these radical youths suffered a terrible psychological breakdown. Since they couldn't mobilize the masses, they had to cut off the snake's head with their own hands. They formed a secret, highly disciplined, and ruthless terrorist organization called Narodnaya Volya, meaning People's Will. They had one goal: to assassinate Tsar Alexander II and cripple the state. They derailed his trains, blew up the Winter Palace's refectory, but the Tsar miraculously survived each time. Until that snowy St. Petersburg morning of March 1st, 1981.
As the Tsar's armored carriage passed along the Catherine Canal, an assassin who had infiltrated the crowd threw the first bomb at the carriage. The carriage was destroyed. The guards fell to the ground covered in blood, but the Tsar remained unharmed. As he stepped out of the armored carriage to attend to the wounded to display that imperial arrogance, a second assassin, Ignaty Grinovitsky, leapt forward from the crowd and dropped his bomb directly at the Tsar's feet. Following the deafening explosion, the scene that emerged when the smoke cleared was horrific. The Savior Tsar's legs were shattered, his blood staining the pristine white snow crimson. He was immediately carried to his study in the Winter Palace, but it was too late. Tsar Alexander II died of blood loss on those magnificent marble floors. Herein lay the cruel irony of history. The Tsar who had freed slaves was torn to pieces by young men yearning for freedom. Moreover, that day the Tsar carried in his pocket a draft of a historic reform that would transform Russia into a constitutional monarchy, and it was to be signed. The assassins thought they would start a revolution by killing the Tsar, but they only hastened their own demise. As the Tsar's blood-stained uniform was tucked away in the Winter Palace cupboards, his colossal, half-bare son, Tsar Alexander III, who would succeed him, would not let his father's blood go unavenged and would crush Russia with an unprecedented, dark, and uncompromising iron fist.
On March 1, 1881, the blood that dripped onto the marble floor of the Winter Palace was not only the blood of Tsar Alexander II, but also the blood of all liberal hopes in Russia. Watching his father's mutilated body in horror, the new Tsar, Alexander III, made a decisive decision that day. His father had been murdered because he had been too lenient with the people, because he had granted them too many rights. Freedom would only bring anarchy and bloodshed to Russia. The only thing that could sustain the state was uncompromising fear and absolute obedience. Tsar Alexander III was as colossal physically as his policies, a formidable man, strong enough to bend a horseshoe with his hands, resembling a Russian bear. Upon ascending the throne, he tore up the draft constitution that had been found in his father's pocket. He summarized the empire's new and sole course in 3 words: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationalism. The powers of the secret police, the Okhrana, were increased unprecedentedly. Opposition intellectuals, students, and anyone who even slightly demanded reform were taken from their homes in the middle of the night and sent directly into the freezing darkness of Siberia. But there was a huge paradox. While the Tsar wanted to politically freeze Russia in the Middle Ages, economically he had to launch a frantic industrialization drive to compete with the West. Foreign capital was invited into the country. The legendary Trans-Siberian Railway was built, and enormous factories rose around St. Petersburg and Moscow. These factories were the biggest time bomb placed in the heart of Russian sociology. Because the factories were hungry for workers. The poor peasants, freed from serfdom but drowning in debt, left their villages and migrated en masse to the cities to feed themselves. Thus, a completely new class was born in Russia, one that had never existed before: the proletariat, the industrial working class. The living conditions of this new class were a veritable hell. Working hours reaching 14 hours a day, complete lack of job security, and dozens of families forced to sleep crammed together in stuffy, damp barracks. But there was something the Tsar didn't understand. Tens of thousands of workers, united, beginning to read and write, and sharing a common suffering, were 100 times more dangerous than scattered and uneducated peasants. The red specter haunting Europe, the ideas of Karl Marx, were slowly infiltrating these massive workers' barracks through clandestine printing presses, organizing that righteous anger. Alexander III could withstand this immense pressure for a while longer with his enormous stature. But when he unexpectedly died of kidney failure in 1994 at only 49 years old, the fatal flaw of absolute autocracy became apparent. If all power is in the hands of one man, and that man is weak, the system collapses instantly.
His shy, hesitant 26-year-old son, Nicholas II, crushed under his father's enormous shadow and completely clueless about statecraft, ascended the throne. When the last Romanov Tsar, Nicholas, ascended the throne, he would make that bitter confession to a relative in tears. "I don't want to be Tsar. I don't know how to govern this country. I don't even know how to speak to the ministers." Nicholas was a man with absolute power, but completely devoid of the will to use it. His only refuge would be the guidance of his ambitious German wife, Empress Alexandra, who was obsessively devoted to mysticism. This weakness and lack of vision manifested itself from day one with a terrible catastrophe. In May 1996, a massive public festival was held on the Kodinka Plain outside Moscow in honor of the new Tsar's coronation. Rumors spread that the Tsar would distribute free sausages, beer, and souvenir cups to the people. That morning, more than 500,000 hungry and impoverished people had gathered on the plain. Suddenly, rumors spread that the gifts wouldn't be enough and those at the back wouldn't receive anything. A human tide surged forward in panic. The enormous crowd began to trample each other. In just a few hours, that festival ground turned into a mass grave. Over 1,300 people, women, children, and men, perished horribly, crushed or suffocated. Thousands more were seriously injured. This alone was a terrible tragedy, but Nicholas II's true downfall was his reaction to the disaster. While the bodies of thousands of dead were still being loaded onto carriages, the Tsar attended a lavish ball given by the French ambassador that same evening. While his own people were dying in the streets, the new master of the Winter Palace was sipping French champagne and waltzing. Nicholas's decision to attend the ball, though a diplomatic necessity, was an unforgivable betrayal in the eyes of the people. That night, the last emotional bond between the Russian people and the Winter Palace was broken forever. The people gave their new Tsar an irrevocable name, Bloody Nicholas. Russia, in the hands of a weak leader, was blindly hurtling towards the colossal machine of the approaching 20th century. And very soon, a small yellow nation from the other end of Asia would expose Russia's hollow arrogance to the whole world.
As the 20th century dawned, Russia had become a giant powder keg. Factory workers writhed in misery, peasants in the villages gnawed at the earth out of hunger, and university students dreamed of revolution every day. Tsar Nicholas II and his corrupt aristocracy resorted to the oldest and most dangerous trick in history to release this enormous sociological pressure from within, creating an enemy abroad and uniting the people around the Tsar with nationalist hysteria. The famous and arrogant statement of the then Minister of Internal Affairs, Plave, was the recipe for the impending disaster. All we need to stop the revolution is a small and victorious war. The target chosen was that small island nation on the other side of the map, Japan. The Russian court never considered an Asian nation its equal, despising them as little yellow monkeys. As imperialist rivalry over Manchuria and Korea intensified, Russia eagerly awaited the outbreak of war. However, in February 1904, when the Japanese Navy launched a deadly raid on the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur without declaring war, the hollow arrogance of the Winter Palace received its first major blow. The Japanese army, with its modern weapons, British-built battleships, and incredible discipline, virtually paralyzed the Russian army on land and sea. To salvage the situation, Tsar Nicholas sent the Baltic fleet from Europe to the other side of the world to fight Japan. This was one of the most tragic-comic and desperate military maneuvers history has ever seen. The old, cumbersome, coal-burning Russian ships undertook a nightmarish 30,000-kilometer journey around Africa, lasting 7 months and rife with disease and mutiny. When the exhausted fleet reached the Tsushima Strait in May 1905, it was literally wiped off the map in just a few hours by the waiting Japanese Navy. Thousands of Russian sailors perished at the bottom of the ocean. The Tsushima debacle was not merely a military defeat. For the first time in modern history, a European power had been so utterly and overwhelmingly destroyed by an Asian nation.
In the eyes of the world, the Russian bear had been hollowed out, the invincible empire reduced to a paper tiger. When this humiliating news reached Russia via telegraph, the dream of a small and victorious war paved the way for a great and deadly revolution. The economic collapse brought about by the war drove hunger and anger in the streets of St. Petersburg to an unbearable point. Factories closed, bread prices skyrocketed. It was in this moment of absolute despair, on Sunday, January 9, 1905, that the unprecedented march that would change the course of history began. At the head of the march was Georgy Gapon, not an anarchist or Bolshevik, but an Orthodox priest. A massive crowd of about 100,000 workers, along with their women and children, marched towards the Winter Palace. They carried no weapons. At the forefront were crosses, religious icons, and enormous portraits of Tsar Nicholas II. They sang hymns in chorus. The people still harbored that millennia-old, deeply rooted belief. Our little father, the Tsar, doesn't know how much we suffer. Wicked nobles are hiding the truth from him. If we go to the palace and deliver our petition directly to him, our father will protect and save us. When the crowd reached the enormous palace square, the square of the Winter Palace, in the freezing cold, they found not their little father, but thousands of soldiers with bayonets fixed and guns pointed at them. Tsar Nicholas wasn't even at the palace that day. He had fled with his family to his summer residence outside the city in fear. Tension in the square escalated, and then the order was given. The soldiers opened fire on the unarmed, hungry, and desperate people carrying portraits of the Tsar. Cavalrymen drew their swords and charged into the fleeing women and children. In just a few minutes, the white snow was stained crimson with the blood of hundreds of people. The square was filled with screams, groans, and the smell of gunpowder. People stared in horror at the portraits of the Tsar that had fallen from their hands and were now covered in blood. On that day, which went into history as Bloody Sunday, the blood splattered on the marble of the Winter Palace was not only the blood of innocent civilians, but also the blood of Russia's oldest and most sacred legend, the myth of the good Tsar. On that day, in that square, the people's faith in the state died forever. The words of a worker who had risen among the corpses during the unarmed march summed it all up. We no longer have a Tsar. Bloody Sunday dragged Russia down an irreversible path into the flames of the 1905 revolution. The Winter Palace was no longer a refuge for the people, but a symbol of tyranny that had to be overthrown. The Tsar would take a tactical step back, agreeing to establish a parliament, Duma, and proclaim a constitution to quell the rebellion. But this would only postpone the storm of the great catastrophe that was to come, the storm of 1917.
The flames of the 1905 revolution and the horrors of Bloody Sunday had shaken the Winter Palace to its foundations, forcing Tsar Nicholas II, albeit reluctantly, to establish a parliament, Duma, and proclaim a constitution that limited his powers. The Winter Palace ostensibly still stood, but inside, a profound psychological collapse was unfolding. The Tsar and Tsarina, completely detached from the people, were trapped within their own self-created, gilded, and paranoid bubble. They didn't care about the vast, angry empire outside, for behind the closed doors of the Winter Palace, a family tragedy far greater, far more terrifying, and kept as a state secret was unfolding. The young Tsarevich Alexei, the only male heir to the Romanov throne, carried a fatal genetic disease inherited from his mother, Tsarina Alexandra, hemophilia. Because of this terrible disease, in which the blood did not clot, even the slightest fall or bump into something caused the young prince to suffer internal bleeding lasting for days, unbearable pain, and death. The best European doctors of the time were helpless. Empress Alexandra, driven to the brink of madness by her son's cries, had become obsessively attached to Orthodox mysticism, supernatural powers, and miracles. Her despair as a mother was about to become the weakness of a vast empire.
It was in this dark and hopeless atmosphere in late 1905 that one of history's strangest, most repulsive, and most controversial figures stepped through the gates of the Winter Palace: Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was an illiterate, unkempt, alcoholic, and womanizing peasant from a remote Siberian village. He presented himself as a holy man, a healer who could speak directly with God. He possessed an incredibly hypnotic, piercing gaze and a dark charisma that psychologically captivated those around him. Known as a kind of exotic entertainment among the bored aristocratic women of St. Petersburg society, this man was eventually brought before the desperate empress. And the unbelievable miracle occurred. Little Tsarevich Alexei, bleeding to death, was healed thanks to Rasputin's prayers, hypnotic whispers, and perhaps simply his ability to calm the child and slow his heart rate. The bleeding stopped. For Empress Alexandra, Rasputin was no longer just a peasant, but a divine messenger sent by God to save Russia and her son. Rasputin's entry into the court was the greatest poison that sealed Russia's fate. This uneducated Siberian peasant became, in just a few years, the most powerful man in the empire. While no appointments could be made without the approval of the Tsar and Tsarina, now the words emanating from Rasputin's lips determined who would be ministers, generals, and high-ranking bureaucrats. Meritocracy had completely collapsed, and the highest echelons of the state had fallen into the hands of charlatans, bribe-takers, and fortune-tellers. Outside, the situation was even more repulsive. Rasputin's endless drunkenness in the streets of St. Petersburg, his immoral sex parties with the wives of the nobility, and his scandals filled the headlines of newspapers daily. The Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, reported these scandals to the Tsar, but the Tsarina, unwilling to tarnish the reputation of her sacred man, immediately dismissed the ministers who brought these reports. Sociologically, this was the final nail in the coffin of the empire's centuries-old and sacred legitimacy. For centuries, the Romanov dynasty, believed to be God's representatives on earth, was now nothing more than the protagonist of a vile and immoral joke in the eyes of the average worker or soldier. Rumors that the empress was Rasputin's lover and that they had handed over the state to a peasant had spread like poison throughout Russia. A state could survive through oppression, bloodshed, or fear. However, the Winter Palace had fallen into the worst possible situation in history, becoming a laughingstock. From the aristocracy to the peasants, from the merchants to the soldiers, no one had an ounce of respect for the state. In that freezing December of 1916, Rasputin was brutally murdered by a group of ultra-nationalist Russian noblemen who wanted to save the empire's honor. Poisoned, shot, and finally thrown into the icy Neva River. But it was too late. The Siberian peasant had already injected a deadly virus into the gilded veins of the Romanov dynasty. Moreover, while Rasputin was living in luxury in his palace, Russia had already entered the greatest, bloodiest, and most destructive catastrophe in its history: the global apocalypse in which millions of Russian peasants would freeze to death in the trenches. The First World War. When history cast a colossal shadow over humanity during those stifling summer months of 1914, Tsar Nicholas II, greeting the people from the balcony of the Winter Palace, was unaware that he was playing the greatest and deadliest gamble of his life. Europe was hurtling towards an unprecedented catastrophe: the First World War. Initially, a false patriotic fervor reigned in the streets of St. Petersburg. Even the capital's name was hastily changed to Petrograd because it sounded too German. Crowds gathered around the Tsar, singing national anthems and pledging allegiance to their little father. But this hysteria would give way, within months, to blood, mud, and unimaginable horror. On paper, Russia possessed the world's largest army, the Russian roller, but this roller was completely empty. Millions of peasants, or muzhiks, had been conscripted to defend the homeland and sent to the Western Front, to those deadly trenches.
However, the Winter Palace's corrupt bureaucracy and collapsed industry were utterly incapable of feeding and equipping this massive army. One of the most tragic scenes history has ever seen unfolded in these trenches. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers were sent to the front without a single weapon. Their commanders gave them this chilling order: attack unarmed. When your comrade in front is shot and falls, pick up his rifle and continue fighting. The soldiers had no boots. They wrapped their feet in rags and marched through the snow towards German machine guns. Logistics were so paralyzed that instead of ammunition, wagon loads of rusty swords or bullets of the wrong caliber were sent to the front. In the first year alone, millions of Russian soldiers were either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. Battles like those at Lake Tannenberg and Lake Masuria were literally slaughterhouses for the Russian army. It was at this unprecedented moment of sociological collapse that Tsar Nicholas II made the most foolish strategic mistake in history. In 1915, under the pretext of boosting army morale, he personally assumed command, left the capital, and went to the front. The Tsar, who possessed no military genius, was now directly responsible for every defeat at the front. Even more frightening, to whom had he entrusted the administration of Petrograd and the vast empire while he was at the front? To the German-born, publicly hated Empress Alexandra and her puppet, the Siberian charlatan Grigory Rasputin. The Winter Palace became a madhouse where merit had completely evaporated, and ministers were appointed and dismissed according to Rasputin's fantasies. Even when Rasputin was assassinated in late 1916, it was too late. The war had crippled Russia's economy. All the trains were used to transport soldiers and ammunition to the front, leaving no wagons to bring food to the cities. Petrograd was experiencing a freezing winter, with kilometer-long queues of bread in front of bakeries. Moreover, those waiting in these queues were angry, desperate women whose husbands and sons had frozen to death in the trenches. The breaking point came spontaneously, in a way no political party had planned. On February 23rd, March 8th, according to the Gregorian calendar, thousands of women working in Petrograd's textile factories poured into the freezing streets, shouting bread. They were soon joined by striking workers from the Putilov iron and steel factory. The slogans quickly changed. Cries of "We want bread" turned into shouts of "Down with war" and "Down with autocracy." The Tsar, who was at the front, did not take the situation seriously and sent that familiar, deadly order by telegram: immediately suppress the unrest in the capital with force. But the Tsar had forgotten that brutal rule of sociology. The strength of a state depends on its soldiers being willing to pull the trigger. The soldiers in Petrograd's garrison were not the soldiers of that bloody Sunday of 1905. They too were hungry. They too were poor peasant boys afraid to go to the front. When they were given the order to fire, they turned their barrels not on the people, but on their officers. The soldiers left their barracks and joined the revolution. The state's monopoly on violence evaporated that very second. Within a few days, the Tsar's train, trying to return from the front, was stopped by his own railway workers. At Pskov station, in an abandoned, lonely, and dark carriage, Nicholas II, seeing that even his own generals had abandoned him, signed that historic document. He abdicated. The terrible Romanov dynasty, which had played with the fate of Asia and Europe for 300 years, ended not with a bloody palace raid, but silently in a cold train carriage with the ink drops of an exhausted man. The February Revolution had overthrown the Winter Palace and supposedly made Russia the freest country in the world. But this was not the end of the storm, only its glimmer. The war was still raging, the people were still hungry, and that bald, sharp-eyed man in exile, having set out from Switzerland on a sealed train to Petrograd, was coming to deliver that final, bloody blow to the Winter Palace.
In February 1917, with Tsar Nicholas II's abdication in that dark, cold train carriage, the vast 300-year-old Romanov Empire vanished in an instant. Russia, seemingly, was experiencing its freest days. Censorship had been lifted, political prisoners released, and a provisional government composed of liberal aristocrats and bourgeois had been established to govern the country. However, history teaches us a cruel lesson. If you grant freedom only on paper to a starving society, that freedom will very quickly turn into anarchy. The provisional government made the most fatal mistake history has ever seen. The Russian people, the millions of peasants freezing to death in those muddy trenches, had only one cry: for the war to end. But the new government, in order not to break the alliance with Britain and France and to save the empire's honor, decided to continue World War I. Soldiers were still dying in the trenches, women were still waiting in bread lines. The masters of the Winter Palace had changed, but the freezing and starving reality of the streets remained the same. Power lay unclaimed in the streets, and it needed someone brave, uncompromising, and ruthless enough to pick it up. It was in this sociological vacuum that in April 1917, a sealed train that had secretly traveled across Europe from Germany pulled into Finland Station in Petrograd. The man who stepped out was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, a sharp-eyed, bald man who had been in exile for years and carried an uncompromising revolutionary plan in his mind. The Germans had deliberately allowed Lenin to return to Russia to collapse it from within and force it to withdraw from the war. This was the most successful and deadly biological weapon history had ever seen, for Lenin was to inject the unstoppable Bolshevik virus into the veins of Russia. When Lenin stepped off the train at the station, he rejected the moderate policies of the provisional government and shouted the three magic words that the people wanted to hear, words that pierced the very heart of sociology: peace, land, and bread. This slogan was far more effective than complex Marxist theories. It promised peace to the soldiers, land to the peasants, and bread to the workers. As the months passed, soldiers who had deserted the front and returned to the capital with their weapons, and workers who had seized factories, rallied around the Bolsheviks in their own assemblies, which they called Soviets. The Red Guards, established with the military genius of Lev Trotsky, were now the true masters of the streets. The provisional government was completely paralyzed, confined to the enormous, empty rooms of the Winter Palace. On October 25, 1917, November 7th according to the Gregorian calendar, one of the greatest turning points in human history occurred. The Aurora cruiser, anchored on the Neva River, signaled the revolution with its famous blank cannon shot. Unlike the massive, bloody battles we see in films, the takeover of the Winter Palace was an extremely quiet, swift, and almost bureaucratic operation, because there was no one left inside to defend the government. A few hundred military students and a women's death battalion guarding the palace laid down their arms and surrendered in the face of the enormous crowd of Red Guards. When Bolshevik soldiers and sailors broke through the gilded doors of the Winter Palace, they walked with muddy boots down the vast marble corridors where the czars had sipped champagne and held balls for centuries. Ministers were arrested. The Winter Palace, which had shaken Europe for 300 years, had fallen into the hands of ordinary workers and peasants. The next day, Lenin stood on the rostrum of the Congress of Soviets and uttered that historic, chilling, and decisive sentence: "Comrades, the workers' and peasants' revolution has been accomplished. Now is the time to build the socialist order." The old order was to be physically destroyed, not only in the Winter Palace, but also in the person of the Romanovs. In July 1918, the deposed Tsar Nicholas, his wife Alexandra, and their sickly young son Alexei, along with their entire family, were brutally murdered by a Bolshevik firing squad in the cellar of their house in Yekaterinburg, where they were imprisoned. The sickly, hollow arrogance of the dynasty was wiped away forever in that freezing cellar, covered in blood. This bloody saga of Russia gives us one of history's most brutal yet clearest sociological lessons. A state, no matter how large its army, how magnificent its palaces and secret police, is doomed to collapse the moment it becomes detached from the reality, poverty, and suffering of its own people. This process, beginning with Peter the Great's dream of westernization, growing with Catherine the Great's oppression of the serfs, and exploding with Nicholas II's arrogance, is the most terrifying proof of how incompetence and inequality can rot an empire from within. The magnificent walls of the Winter Palace crumbled, and in its place a completely different world born, equally bloody and brutal: the Soviet Union. The fate of the 20th century was written that day on that snowy Petrograd night. Thank you for walking with us through the corridors of the Winter Palace on this vast historical and sociological journey. If you enjoyed this series, please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments which historical figure's personality affected you the most. Until we meet again in a new story on those dusty and brutal pages of history, farewell.